Batman is so cool that even Superman wants to be him. Let's see how many people get triggered by that. Everyone, just letting you know that all figures found in this review could be found over at bigbadtoystore.com. Links could be found in the description below, and if you guys use them, they help out the channel quite a bit. Similar to a lot of comic book one-offs like Superman Red Sun, there was eventually a one-off in 1993 that pretty much tackled what if Superman was adopted by the Waynes versus the Kents in Gotham City. And so this is pretty much a figure interpreted by that comic line in which Superman pretty much becomes Batman. And taking a really long gander at the figure itself, kind of feeling him in hand, there's something that kind of came to mind almost immediately, and that is that I really do like the proportions and the sculpting behind the figure, but there was a specific reason as to why, and that's because, for the most part, minus a couple of obvious modifications, this figure is kind of borrowing certain elements and sculpt detail as the DC Rebirth Batman. I'm not saying it's exactly one-to-one, but there's certain proportions out of the body, specifically those thick-ass legs and thighs, that really did remind me of that particular Batman. Now, in that figure review, I did mention that one of the things that did stand out to me, not necessarily in the most positive light, was in fact those legs and how slightly disproportionate they looked to the rest of the body because of the much more slimmer nature of his face, his neck, and kind of that whole torso area. But here they were able to somewhat rectify that, if you want to call it that, because a little bit more of that proportion was kind of balanced out. Granted, it only took for Superman, aka Kal-El, to embody the figure, embody the costume, in order to kind of give us a much more proportionate representation, because as you can see here, the body sculpting and the detail is actually much more proportionate than it was in that prior DC Rebirth figure, in my opinion, and because of that, everything just looks very streamlined and very, very good as far as sculpting and detail and proportions. I know I'm kind of repeating myself a little bit here, but I'm actually really enjoying how much I like this figure as far as just simply looking at him and playing with him, as far as those little factors that play into the sculpting that sure can feel like it's reusing assets, but at least they're reusing them in the right way. With that being said, the color spectrum could have been a little bit more bold, I would say. I understand that they're trying to kind of merge the two color schemes together as far as the very bright baby blue that he's got going on for the cape and the cowl, especially since this is technically still speaking Superman underneath that cowl. But then we have the muted grays and the black underwear, as well as the yellow accents for the symbol, as well as the utility belt. So I can see an awful lot of that, and you know, upon first glance it works. I just wish that there was a little bit more of pronunciation with the boldness of the colors. You get what I'm saying? Like maybe if the blue was just a little bit more of a navy blue versus a baby blue, but of course that's more so of a complaint on the design of the character, not so much on the McFarlane. Outside of that though, this is, in my opinion, one of the finer looking McFarlanes that the DC Multiverse line has produced thus far, because I really like I said, the broadness of the shoulders and how the cape is pretty much able to encroach all of that. And the cowl itself, despite not having it cut out for the mouth as per tradition for a Batman cowl, as it's always had, I actually really like how the way everything is just sculpted out and etched out, especially with the wide eyes and where the mouth should be. It kind of just draws some inspiration from that original comic book line that feels pretty ominous. And then that shield, I really like it. I wasn't expecting to like it because I don't like, from a design standpoint, how stretched the bat symbol is. But when you take into account the actual shape of the shield there on his chest, it's supposed to mimic that of the Superman classic shield. And then furthermore, McFarlane went ahead and actually made that kind of a piece in and of itself that's actually imbued on the chest of the figure. It's kind of hard to really show it off except for maybe from the underside of the chest area, but you can see right there that it's actually popping off from the chest. So it's not just a painted on decal, it's an actual separate piece that was kind of imbued on the chest portion of the figure itself, and I can really commend that. Once we get down to the gauntlets and the boots, it's pretty much standard fare minus a couple of extra padding and lining going on right there on the sides of his obliques, shoulders, and legs that, like I said, just kind of give an added level of quality and detail to the costume that really sells us that this is Superman underneath there. The only thing I'm not a huge fan of is that cape. I could kind of respect the creasing and the detailing and the sculpting going on right there with the rubberized cape. I just don't like how it gets kind of tendrily and torn, so to speak, towards the bottom. There's just something about that to me doesn't resonate as well as it should have. And the rubberized crotch piece here that pretty much makes up that underwear portion is a little problematic, but I will demonstrate that a little bit more as we get into articulation. And this is actually another portion where I was reminded an awful lot of that DC Rebirth Batman, because for the most part, a lot of the joints and the way that they were kind of cut out and sculpted are very similar to that DC Rebirth Batman, specifically the torso joint. Before we get to that though, the head of course can rotate 360 degrees as well as move up and downwards and tilt side to side very generously. Of course, the joints at the top of the arms are gonna allow full rotation 360 degrees, but that's only in hypothetical format, considering that the cape is kind of restricting them slightly, but you can extend them to the sides in that classic T-pose. Butterfly joints on the inside of the shoulders do allow some kind of pivoting and swirling from up and down motions, but not as much as one can ultimately desire. I've seen some better ones in other DC McFarlanes, but once we get to the elbows, it's pretty standard fare. It's able to bend all the way upwards, as well as allow the wrist joints to rotate 360 degrees, as well as pivot inwards and outwards. And the reason why is because they're actually adopting, once again, those joints that I really, really like. It's not your traditional ball joint. It's that much more cylindrical joint that's kind of cut in the middle that allows very fluid and comfortable motion of the wrist. And I really, really like that. Just as well, I like the torso joint that I mentioned before. It's here where I was reminded an awful lot of that classic DC Rebirth Batman that I really did like, save for some of the proportion angles. Here we do have a much broader torso because it's meant to be Superman, but thankfully they were still able to retain an awful lot of the movement and comfortable articulation going on the two joints for both the mid-torso cut that's able to rotate 360 degrees, as well as crunch inwards and outwards and from side to side. But thankfully we're also able to get some really good waist articulation that's able to not only kind of squish and crunch from side to side, but also rotate freely 360 degrees, something that even some other traditional McFarlanes are not even able to do. But I mentioned before that crotch rubberized piece can get a little tiresome, a little tedious, and that's because when we get to moving the legs, specifically at the top leg joint, it's when it kind of gets in the way and starts kind of pinching in and of itself that I'm almost kind of scared it's going to start to weather and tear as I kind of move the legs a little bit much more freely. As you can see, as I move the legs forwards and backwards, it's kind of starting to pinch a little bit into the rubberized piece that I feel like I'm gonna start seeing tears if I move this figure enough throughout the years or whatever, however much long I'll have this figure. I feel like that could potentially cause a QC problem. Same thing for the extension, which is pretty generously able to do from side to side, almost a full 180. But I fear that that's going to cause some problems with that rubberized crotch piece. So I don't know if there's probably going to be some kind of solution in the future, or if there's going to be some iterations of this figure re-released in some secondary wave that's going to be able to address this problem. Once we get to the remainder of the legs, again, it pretty much follows the standard traditional articulations that you find in McFarlane's. Two joints at the knee that are able to fully bend all the way up, as well as the ankle joints. Once again, this is the ankle joints that I really, really like, that are pretty much those cylindrical pieces that are cut in half, that allow full rotation all the way around 360 degrees, as well as pivoting up and down, but you don't really compromise any sort of movement in doing so, so that feels really, really good. And then, of course, you cannot forget the toesies that are able to fluidly bend all the way upwards. A curious thing, though, that I did find as I kind of navigated and examined the figure is how clawed up his hands are. It's funny because not even Batman has clawed up hands like this, so it's up to Superman to actually look just a little bit more lethal with those hands. And as such, McFarlane did decide to throw in an extra pair of fisted hands for when he needs to throw down with some enemies, naturally, being that it's Superman. But because it is still Superman or Kal-El underneath the cape and cowl, he is not necessarily going to be sticking to the ground. He's obviously going to be flying, so instead of a traditional black base, McFarlane decided to throw in a flight base with this version of the character. So that's a little attention to detail that I can commend him. Outside of that, your traditional accessories are going to be following suit, which for the most part, I don't really see any other form of accessories demanded with this figure, and because of that, I would say the strengths of the figure, no pun intended there, are able to speak for themselves. And because of that, I will say this is probably a Batman figure that you cannot skip out on. Yes, it's technically not Batman. It is sorry. Oh my god. Oh, I'm about to start a war now. It is Superman. And, you know, I'm not necessarily the biggest Superman fan out there either. But what they were able to do with the character in comic book format here with this one-off series, and what McFarlane was retroactively able to do in figure form by taking what was one of the more complimented figures they released recently in the DC Rebirth version and just kind of pretty much amp it up, improve on it, improve on the proportions, and kind of take a page of what worked and what didn't and put it into a character figure such as Speeding Bullets Batman. I would say this is probably one of the ones that if you're collecting McFarlane Toys, DC Multiverse figures, and you're also trying to get as many of those Batman characters as possible for your collection, much like I am doing, this is probably one that you should definitely not skip out on. As such, I will be giving Speeding Bullets Batman an 8 out of 10. I highly recommend them, and if you want to add them to your collection, there's going to be a link in the description to get them over at Big Bad Toy Store. He's on pre-order right now, but anytime soon they're going to be able to start shipping him out. And since now we have two one-off figures for Superman in the form of Speeding Bullets Batman as well as a Red Sun DC McFarlane toy that came out a couple of years back, my question to you guys is, what kind of one-off version of either Batman or Superman do you want to see McFarlane Toys tackle in their DC Multiverse line? Let me know in the comment section below. If you guys like this video, hit the thumbs up button. If you didn't, hit the thumbs down. Make sure to check out this other McFarlane Toys review showing up on screen. And as always, stay humble. I'll see you on the next one.